Morning, everyone. As Adrian was saying, it's quite nice to be here in London where it's not 45 degrees and I can walk to a meeting for 20 minutes, which is quite a nice experience for me. What's also quite interesting is somewhere like London, which is a mature market, which has decent infrastructure. You've got transportation, the roads aren't all clogged with traffic. I was able to walk on pavements all the way safely. And I didn't really think anything of it at the time because I'm used to being in Britain. But then I thought, hang on a minute, if I was in the Middle East, I wouldn't be able to do that. There's maybe a few pockets of Dubai I could walk around, but I wouldn't be able to do that. Why can't I do that? It's because the infrastructure's not in place. The systems aren't set up. There aren't things like transportation networks. All these things that are being built at the moment are being done at the moment, and they don't have them. So really, the Middle East is not a mature place like somewhere like London, and it's still maturing. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. I could have said it's a lot of things at the moment, and the interesting thing about the GCC, which just for those of you that don't know, the GCCs, there are 6 countries in the Gulf, which is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. Changes quite a lot. Every year something seems to change. It's very different. The sort of the landscape changes, and then different market dynamics are at play. And that affects everything from politics, which most people are aware of the politics in the Middle East. That tends to get most of the sort of the international press attention, but it also has a lot of impact on the way businesses operate and what the business environment's like. So I'll touch on some of those things as well. I think really just to start off, I'll give a slight overview of what I'm going to talk about. And there's really several really key underlying things that are driving the region. The most important thing, in my opinion, is the demographic challenge. You've got a young population, a lot of people that are under the age of, say, 30 that need jobs. Jobs creation's a very prickly subject for the governments. That's particularly difficult because the region, because of oil prices and wealth, has relied quite heavily on expatriate labour and an expatriate workforce. So it's creating the jobs, and then it's creating jobs that the local people want to do. And traditionally, those that have sought employment have tended to stay in the public sector, where it's a lot easier to get a nice little job that sort of fits in with their culture. So demographics is a real issue. And then on top of the employment, you've also got the services issue, which comes back to the point I made earlier, where you have transportation, but then there's things like healthcare, education. So demographics, in my opinion, is the real thing that's driving things at the moment. What's another challenge? Well, this year, really, probably every day for at least half an hour, I've had a coffee with somebody somewhere and talked about oil prices. Where do we think oil prices are going to go? What's going to happen with oil prices? Why is that important? It's pretty obvious. You're in a region where there's very large oil exporters, and oil's a very large percentage of GDP. And particularly government budgets. So anything that the governments are doing to get the money to do that comes from selling oil. So if the oil price is low, it's a problem. A few other things that I think are worth just mentioning. Sort of post-global financial crisis, when I moved to Dubai in 2003, the region was just a great place to be. Everybody that wanted to do anything could go ahead and do it. If you wanted to build the world's tallest tower, no problem. Off you go, get on with it, do it, no problem. If you wanted to build a bouncing tower, I don't think anyone actually tried to do that, but I think a bank would have probably given you some money to do it. Since 2009, that kind of thing doesn't really work anymore. Banks were quite overweight on real estate. Anything that you do come up with really has to be quite bankable. So I think that's really tempered quite a lot of the ambitions, particularly on the private sector. And then that linking with that is real estate itself. We've had a bit of a resurgence in real estate since really the end of 2011. And that lovely thing real estate developers can do from time to time is sell a large volume of property off plan. And once you can do that, you can cover your construction costs quite easily with deposits and the project's self-funding. That had been the story for probably 2011, 2012, and quite a bit of 2013. And then I think that story's changed. So real estate's now a bit more challenging again. And with that issue again with banks, it's become a bit more difficult for real estate to move forward. Some of these I mentioned just on the previous slide. Real focus on job creation. That, I think, is probably one of the main things. As everyone, I'm sure, is aware, there's quite a large security risk, particularly in countries like Saudi Arabia. And the fear of the Saudi leadership is that you have a large number of unemployed, brassed-off young people who don't really have anything to do, and it's quite easy for them to fall into particularly sort of religious extremism. So I think that's trying to get that population active and taking part in the economy in a meaningful way is very important. And then to support that is social infrastructure. So you're seeing a lot of building. It tends to be focused on healthcare and education, but the other one that's massive is housing. There's a huge housing shortage across the region for local people. And that's really an issue that, frankly, the governments have struggled to deal with. I think they, before 2009, thought that the private sector would try and help drive that story, but it's really not happened that effectively. So I think governments are going to have to come in and directly procure a lot of that housing going forward. Response to oil prices, I think really the response, and everybody who follows OPEC and what's been going on with OPEC, is just pump as much oil as you possibly can and try and sell even if the price is low. What does that mean from a sort of an infrastructure point of view? It means you've got to maintain oil production. So I think that's going to be an increasing challenge for the oil exporters in particular. They're going to have to, make sure that things are maintained and everything operates smoothly, because if they have a shutdown, then it impacts their revenue. We're starting with lower oil prices to see the sort of the PPP debate re-emerge. I'm personally a little bit cynical of this. I think that concept started to come around in 2009, where we had dynamics where governments sort of thought they couldn't plough ahead with infrastructure themselves. And then it fizzled out quite quickly. But there are a few governments, notably Kuwait, who've really tried to push forward with this. One of the arguments is not just the funding point of view, where they save government investment, it also brings in expertise and a private sector operator. So from a government which has no expertise in, say, operating a metro, if you do it as a PPP, you get a service provider coming in, building it, it's off your balance sheet, and then they can bring in the expertise to operate it. So it might work, but I'm not 100% convinced that will happen. And then on the property, as I mentioned, there's a much more measured approach, and I'll go into a few things later on. There are, I think, some real opportunities with property, but unlike the good old days of 2003 to 2008, it's not a case of just build anything and it's going to work and everyone's going to buy it. I think you've got to be targeted and aiming certain market niches, which is what you'd expect in most other markets. So just a sort of lead up to where we are today. As I mentioned, pre-2009, there was a real boom across the whole region. I spent most of my time reporting on projects that, looking back, were stupid. There was, I got the first Palm Island. I could understand that it creates a bit more sort of coastline, and that's fine. And okay, I can buy into that. I'll be positive. The second one tested me a little bit, and then the third one that was twice the size of the second one, which was twice the size of the first one, you sort of thought, hang on, this is getting a bit crazy. And I think ultimately everybody else started to think it was a bit crazy. And then maps of the world in the sea that were being reclaimed, 79-kilometre canals being carved out into the desert. That was sort of the story up to 2008, 2009, which ultimately, in the case of Dubai, led to quite a severe debt crisis. Why was that the case? There was a lot of people just lending money to anyone for all sorts of things. You also had a very high oil price, historic highs. And also what was going on at that time, I don't know if any of you were aware, there was quite a lot of speculation on a currency revaluation in the GCC, which meant there was a lot of money flowing into the region expecting this revaluation to happen, which meant bank reserves were quite high, so they were quite happy to lend to anything because they had quite a lot of money in their coffers. So that really fueled what ended up being quite a nasty bubble. 2009, 2011, as I said, there was a debt crisis. Oil prices dropped very, very, very significantly. But just as maybe something just to keep in the back of your mind today, they bounced back quite quickly and were back over 100. I think they crossed 100 again in 2011 during the Arab Spring, so that story didn't last that long. What also happened in that period, Saudi Arabia really became the dominant market. Up until then, I think most companies were really focused on the UAE as far as the construction market was concerned. There was a lot of opportunities in Dubai and in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai. Once that sort of economic shock hit the UAE, people tended to focus more on Saudi Arabia. The reason for that is Saudi Arabia's got a much larger population, had a lot less sort of private real estate. It was a lot more government-funded infrastructure, so a lot of people began to prioritise working in Saudi Arabia more. One other thing, which is something that I thought I'd write about one or two times in 2010, was the Qatar World Cup. And I seem to have been writing about what's going on with the Qatar World Cup ever since. And every time I think they've finally put that issue to bed, that they're going to have the World Cup and everything will go ahead, Sepp Blatter goes on TV and says he's not going to remain as FIFA president, or something will happen. So the Qatar World Cup's another interesting story that's been going on. Abu Dhabi Nuclear, a lot less high profile than the World Cup, but without a doubt very significant. $20 billion power program. And then in the more sort of recent history, we had the Arab Spring, which meant there was a lot of capital flight from places like Libya, Syria, into the region. There's a school of thought that that really drove that resurgence in real estate that I mentioned earlier. I think that's was definitely a catalyst to getting the market moving again. Market confidence has returned, real estate started selling again, infrastructure investment. Main areas for infrastructure investment have been in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Probably 2013 was the real peak of that investment, where you saw Doha Metro and Riyadh Metro contracts being awarded. So in the space of about 3 months, you had about $40 billion worth of rail contracts awarded. So that was quite an interesting few months, to say the least. 2015, if I was talking to the main players in October last year, they were all quite bullish. They were saying 2015 will kind of be a continuation of 2014. Construction companies were saying, expecting margins to improve, market conditions to improve. And what was going on in the background, the oil price was falling. So by the end of last year, the outlook for 2015 was a lot more shaky. Beginning of this year, it really, I think a few people were looking to push the panic button when oil went down to $46 a barrel. I think there was a real concern that it could be quite a bad year. What's happened since then, the market's picked up. The oil price, the last time I checked a couple of days ago, was about $63 a barrel. So that's improved massively since January, but it's still not good for some of the places where they were sort of budgeted on a much higher oil price, which I'll come to in a little bit. What else is going on in the region at the moment? It's not just oil. Politics is playing quite a major role at the moment. At the beginning of the year, myself and a few colleagues rather morbidly said, well, we could be looking at 3 leadership changes in the GCC. The ruler, the president of the UAE, is not very well and is expected to pass away in the not too distant future. The Sultan of Oman was in Germany for treatment. He's now returned, but for a while he was not looking very well. And then the other one was King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia. There was a lot of speculation that he was old and not long left, and by the end of January he had died. So that's another thing which has been going on. Saudi Arabia, by far and away the most interesting market this year. Crown Prince Salman became king in January, and there's been a lot of change coming in Saudi Arabia as a result of that, which I'll come to a bit later on in Saudi Arabia. But basically, the very, very top line, what's happened in Saudi Arabia is, for the last however many years, we've been looking at this issue. Because of the way the succession works in Saudi Arabia, it's passed from the brothers of King Abdulaziz, who died in the early 50s, I think, and it's just passed from brother to brother. And there was this huge question about where it goes to in the next generation. And now with King Salman in place, we've got people from the new generation in the succession. So that's given clarity, but it's also, I think, changed the way Saudi Arabia is looking at things. I think you're starting to see Saudi Arabia being run by a younger cadre of people, which is changing the business environment. And it's a changing story, but that's what seems to be going on at the moment. Security is also a major issue. Saudi Arabia in particular is engaged in military operations in Yemen, which is on its southern border. I don't know how many of you saw in the news, but the Houthi rebels in Yemen fired a Scud missile into Saudi Arabia last week, so it's really on their doorstep. It's a real issue. And you've seen the US withdrawing from the region. You're seeing a much more assertive and muscular foreign policy, particularly from Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE around the region. So they've been involved in bombing campaigns against IS or ISIS in Iraq. And then domestically, that issue's starting to come back. You're starting to see things coming back. So there's been 2 attacks in Saudi Arabia over the past month in the eastern province by IS, which is quite a calculated move if you wanted to destabilize Saudi Arabia, because that's a largely Shia area. So you have the possibility for tension. You have someone setting off bombs. It causes a few concerns. And then the last one, real estate. Dubai's market, which is really the main sort of private sector area for real estate, is oversupplied, prices are weakening. So that's really had an impact on, particularly on the construction sector. However, with all that, the thing that's continuing to go along is population growth. All the countries in the region have got populations that are growing. That creates a lot of challenges. A lot of things need to be delivered. So that's really the key driver, as I said earlier. In terms of GDP, Saudi Arabia is the largest economy. It's got the largest population, which is around 28, 29 million people. In terms of the GCC, its GDP accounts for about 45% of the GCC's GDP. Second is the UAE. Which is very difficult to know how many people there are actually in the UAE. They had a census which gave very, very poor figures. I think the general consensus at the moment, it's about 6 to 8 million people. Qatar, a growing economy, but smaller than the UAE and Saudi Arabia, obviously. The thing which stands Qatar out is Qatar, because it's a small population, but it has large gas reserves, which it exports and gets a lot of money for. GDP per capita in Qatar is very, very high. As a country, they have a large disposable income. If you look at them from a sort of a personal finance point of view, they've got a lot of money to spend. And that's really where a lot of this sort of the desire to do things like the World Cups come from. If you look at what was going on in Qatar before 2009, they were investing very, very heavily in their LNG export facilities and the LNG trains, which didn't really attract any real publicity unless you were involved in oil and gas. They got finished in around 2009, 2010. My feeling is that Qatar's economy around then kind of lost its focus a little bit. They were sort of like, well, what do we do next? And the World Cup really crystallized their ambitions for the future, and that sort of really gave a lot of impetus to what's going on in Qatar today. Oil, as I said, remains very, very important. Just a bit of data that I took out of the latest BP statistical review shows that the Middle East is the largest region in the world still for oil production, despite what's been going on in North America in terms of oil and gas ramping up there. It's about 28 million barrels a day, so very, 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 very active still in oil production. I think what's changed just from a sort of slightly geopolitical point of view is that in the past, the region's been a lot more Western looking. I think as the US has become more self-reliant on hydrocarbons and the Far East and Asia's economies have been growing, you're seeing a GCC that's a lot more Eastern looking in the way it does business. So last week I was at DIFC, which is the Dubai International Finance Centre's strategy briefing, and they were really looking east. I think the region's sort of the way it faces itself is starting to look more eastward than westward at the moment. There we have what's been going on with average oil prices over the last 10 years. As you can see, it goes up and down and moves quite dramatically. I can remember writing a feature in 2004, it must have been, and I can remember the opening sentence was, with oil prices at $47 a barrel, the region can afford to pretty much do whatever it wants. And now I'm sitting here complaining that prices are $65 a barrel. So you forget quite easily how much oil prices do move and how you get used to what oil prices were. The drop in oil price, as I said, has a major impact on GDP. We're expecting GDP to be stunted as a result of the drop in oil price over the next few years. If you have a slightly sort of gloomy outlook, you could say that's a real problem for the economies, and particularly in the construction sector, because the GDP growth's gone down, then there won't be as much investment. I think the thing that's really driving that sort of school of thought is that the break-even prices are now quite high. You've got these countries that have got large populations that need supporting. There's a large amount of subsidy and handout that goes out to the people, because a lot of the people that aren't working have public sector jobs or just actual handouts of cash. Probably the best story was Kuwait, and I think it was 2010, just paid off everybody's debts on the stock markets. They just said everyone's debts, we'll just pay it off. So you start to realise how much of a sort of financial commitment that some of these governments have given to their people, and that obviously has an impact on what they require for a break-even price. So what you're seeing governments over the next few years, they're going to have to go into the red. They're going to have to maintain spending and keep the economies moving. They're going to have to go at deficits, which is considerably different to what's been going on in the past. On the positive, they have been running surpluses a lot of places in recent years, so they've got the financial wherewithal to weather the storm. And I guess the strategy is that they'll take this next few years, and then once the markets stabilise again as far as oil, they can, and also from their side, cut back on some of the subsidies, etc., etc. They can run a more efficient economy. For this year, budgeted spending is increasing, so that's driving that sort of budget deficit type story. The exception is Kuwait, but you're definitely seeing publicly there's still a commitment to maintaining spending. I think the interesting thing from a construction point of view is, what does that actually mean? I think what that actually means is that the work that was let in 2014, 2013 will continue. You're not seeing a sort of 2009 scenario where people are cancelling contracts with contractors on site and tower blocks half finished or roads half built. What you'll see is what's on site at the moment and people building will be completed. And I think that's reflected in those budgeted spending plans. What will, I think, be more difficult is new capital investment. So it's that project that's moving from, well, we've got the designs, we're now going to tender it. I think that's where you're going to see a bit more pressure going forward in terms of new order book for construction companies. Why is that important? For the construction sector, and I'm using the term construction very, very broadly. I'm using the sort of the project sector really. There's a huge amount of investment. We've been tracking what we call the Gulf Projects Index, which also includes Iraq and Iran, which aren't in the GCC. And that's roughly the GCC countries. There's about $2.5 trillion worth of spending that's either actually on site at the moment or is in the planning process. So it's a huge market which attracts a lot of attention. So companies like Interserve from the UK are obviously operating in that space, but you get companies from all over the world. And it's become a much more international marketplace over the last few years. So you've got your sort of traditional Far Eastern companies, sort of the Koreans. In more recent years, maybe over the last decade or so, you've seen growing engagement from Chinese companies, Indians, pretty much everywhere in Europe. You're even seeing companies from places like Brazil coming into the market and looking to win work. So it's really it's quite a lucrative, well, it's quite an attractive market for a lot of people, just given the amount of spending that's A, going on at the moment, and B, that's forecast to go on in the future. How much work is being awarded? We track how much is awarded each year. From that, you can see there was it goes up and down a little bit. The last 2 years have really been very good years. I was personally quite surprised that 2014 beat 2013. 2013 had those big Riyadh and Doha metro contracts that I mentioned. But last year in 2014, the thing that drove those numbers up so high there was a few very big refineries in Kuwait which have got a price tag of about $12 billion. So once you throw them in, the numbers jump up quite quickly. We were forecasting at the end of last year, 2015, to be slightly better. It was, I think, the forecast at the time was around $172 billion. But we've slightly had to review that now. There was quite a debate that we had at the time, because what's happened particularly on the oil and gas sector is that when the oil price has gone down, the oil and gas companies traditionally have been counter-cyclical because they can get better pricing when the oil price is low from their EPC contractors. So quite often you've seen some very, very big oil and gas schemes move ahead when the oil price is low. Particularly in 2009, you saw that with Abu Dhabi investing a lot in their oil and gas production facilities. So we had a bit of a debate at the beginning of the year whether we're going to see that again. The feeling was, and so far this has borne out to be correct, that because we were coming off quite a high base of investment in oil and gas, there wasn't that sort of pent-up amount of projects that they need to go ahead with, that they've been waiting for better pricing. So as a result, I'll just move through. This is just contract awards by country. As a result, what we're seeing so far this year, I ran some numbers in late May. The markets, if you compared what was awarded between 1st of January 2014 and 20th of May 2014, it's down compared to this year, the same time period, it's down about 28%. You can say that 28% that's an absolutely massive drop, and that's a major problem. One thing I will say, just to sort of temper that sort of initial shock reaction, is that it just takes a couple of big jobs, particularly the very big sort of power plant, refinery, metro type work, to be awarded, and all of a sudden you jump up and make up that shortfall. That said, I think the region has quite a lot of progress to make in the second half of this year if it wants to really stay, even if it just stays flat on last year. And my expectation at the moment is that we will be down on last year, but I don't think it will be catastrophic, but I think it will. I think the region's got a lot of work to do over the next few months, particularly after the summer period. What does that mean in terms of the individual countries? Well, the surprise really has been Saudi Arabia, which has actually increased spending. I'll come back to Saudi Arabia in a little bit. I've got slides on each country, but Saudi Arabia was up. The UAE was significantly down, and a lot of that shortfall came from the UAE. That, I think, is mostly due to the real estate market cooling off. In the first half of 2014, there was some very big property construction contracts awarded in Dubai across a range of things, shopping malls, tower blocks, and they just haven't really materialised this year. There's quite a lot that's planned to happen, notably in Dubai, during the rest of this year. Question is, will that go ahead? Qatar has remained broadly flat this year. The general feeling in the marketplace, talking very, very macro, is that what you've had an oil price go down, so you've got clients, whether it be a government client who gets his budget coming through from a government who gets their money from oil exports, or if you're looking, say, on the actual oil companies themselves, on oil fields and development projects there, is that they're looking for better pricing because their budgets are under pressure. You've then got a contractor who is saying, well, I can't give you a better price because I was giving you my best price last year when you tendered it, and the cost of my inputs hasn't gone down. So my feeling is that the market's a little bit out of equilibrium at the moment. So it just needs to sort of right itself. The construction industry's frankly never really in equilibrium, depending on who you speak to. Clients will always say their contractors are too expensive, and the contractors will say there's no margin and they can't possibly do the work for that price. So I guess finding the equilibrium is a never-ending challenge, but I do feel that the market's a bit out of whack at the moment, and I think it needs to just sort of find its feet again as it adjusts to this oil price. Speaking of cost consultants, they say that they're advising their clients that there's a bit of a respite in cost inflation. There was some quite aggressive numbers being thrown around last year, particularly in Qatar, on cost inflation, which introduced quite a lot of risk into the market. They're saying that that's not really expected to materialise this year. So what they're saying to clients is, look, if you do have funding and you do have a project that you want to go ahead with, now's the time to go out into the market and procure services, because next year the anticipation is that the market, once it's found this equilibrium, will pick up and gather a bit of steam, and you'll start to see that inflation kick in again. And then that last point is just again about oil price recovery helping drive the market. So for the rest of this year and going forward, where do I see the main areas of activity? What sort of things do I think I'll be reporting on and my colleagues reporting on? I've split it into three broad sectors. In the oil and gas and petrochemicals side, it's really upstream oil and gas, I think. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on maintaining production. You're seeing everybody seems to be running at pretty much full capacity at the moment. That puts a lot of strain on the system. Things need to be maintained. You need shutdown to maintain production. So I think that's a real market that I think is really starting to emerge now. And speaking to people over the last month or two, they're starting to see that coming through from big clients like Aramco and ADNOC. That seems to be the way forward. Downstream, a little bit more of a drive for more refined products. I think you're starting to see that for sort of domestic consumption. Petrochemicals is a funny one. The way oil prices are at the moment, it's a much more competitive landscape for the GCC in terms of petrochemicals. When the oil price is very high, they've got a very big advantage in terms of feedstock, because they can get their feedstock quite cheaply compared to someone in Asia, for example. But when the oil price is low, the Asians or anyone else in the world has that lower oil price as well. So it sort of levels out the sort of competitive advantage. That said, petrochemicals is one of the areas that's been earmarked to drive industrial diversification. So I think there's a real government drive to try and get petrochemicals going, and then that adds in, if you get the big petrochemical plants creating the basic feedstocks and plastics, that then drives other industrial development. So you have things like packaging plants and stuff like that. So I think there's a government desire to keep that sector really going. Not as economically viable as it maybe was when the oil price was higher. For infrastructure, really split into several areas. Transport, there's a lot of transport projects planned. There's metros in several cities in Saudi Arabia. A metro, as I said, in Kuwait. There's a metro in Abu Dhabi, which is very slow, not as in the trains are slow, but slow to make any progress. New airports are still being developed. There's the GCC railway, which is a railway that will connect all 6 GCC countries, and there's ongoing road developments. I think one of the main areas which, regardless of what happens with economies, that we'll still see a lot of investment going in from the public sector will be utilities and power and water. And that's really a sector that's really quite interesting at the moment, as you're starting to see a bit more diversification away from just traditional oil-fired or gas-fired power plants. You're starting to see some very interesting things happening in solar in particular, and also in nuclear. Abu Dhabi's developing the GCC's first nuclear power program. Saudi Arabia has been considering it, so I think you're going to see a little bit of other nuclear projects going through in the future. Another major area which I mentioned earlier is social infrastructure, so that's housing, education and healthcare. And I think that's a real political hot potato. I think regardless of what happens, even if oil prices, for example, fell to 20, which I don't think will happen, I think the governments have to continue to invest in social infrastructure. I think that's just something that, if they do take their eye off the ball with that issue, I think they've got real long-term economic problems and political problems going forward. Real estate, I think there's still some areas for private sector development. Like I said, I think it's in certain niches. I think in the past there's been this just build any real estate and people will buy it and develop it, whereas now I think you have to come up with a well-considered, thought out, proper project of good quality, and a lot more in line with what you see in other markets, say in Europe and North America, where you're starting to see developments now which are in existing areas, so they're no longer building a tower block in the middle of the desert and then everything else gets built around it. You're saying, well, we've got a plot of land in an existing area, let's just build something there. So it's just piggybacking existing infrastructure and things. So I think that's really the way real estate is. And then there's sort of funny little areas where, in Dubai, for example, there's people talking about there's a need for more decent quality 3-star hotel properties, commercial real estate. There's needs for sort of high-end office blocks, sort of things like you see around here, which are nice square buildings with big floor plates that are attractive to international tenants, which haven't really been developed in the past. I was very tempted to say that the market, as it's maturing, is starting to develop projects that seem a lot more sensible, and they're square buildings that are functional and efficient. And the problem with doing that is, well, the virtue in doing that is that it sort of says, well, you're getting a real solid ROI on what you're doing. It makes economic sense, and it's a sort of a well thought out project. I think the exception to that is when you're starting to look at creating destinations. And as I said earlier, rather disparagingly about Dubai earlier, they were doing projects that frankly were stupid. But if you think about it, Palm Islands and things got everybody talking about Dubai, and Dubai's very successfully managed to establish itself as a destination. And I think you'll still see that kind of daring type of project going forward. I think it won't be quite as ambitious as before, but what Dubai's, there's a few projects at the moment. I've put a picture there. That's a new Atlantis resort on the Palm, which, as you can see, is quite a, I can't decide whether I like it or not, but it's quite a striking building. And I think you'll see more of that going forward as Dubai's, again, reinforcing its position as a destination. And that ties into these sort of event-driven programs of work, really, which are going on across the region. So you had the main one in Dubai is the Expo in 2020. So there's a lot of anticipation of development going on in support of that. What you're starting to see are the first sort of pieces of that jigsaw coming together. The Roads and Transport Authority's just about to start tendering a new metro line that will go out to the Expo site. So that's a real proper sort of infrastructure project that will go through there. You're starting to see design consultants pick up work on the actual Expo site itself. So that's all, that picture's starting to come through now. A more advanced one is the Qatar World Cup building program, where it's a very interesting issue, the World Cup. And the thing that I think you need to remember is that the spending program and the projects that are planned for the World Cup, if you speak to Qatari government officials, they'll tell you point blank that they're not for the World Cup, they're for the people of Qatar. So, for example, the guy that's in charge of the rail agency, I said, oh, so this is for the World Cup, and he stopped me straight away and he said, no, it's a project for Qatar, for the people of Qatar. Yes, it will be used during the World Cup and help people get to the matches, etc., but it's a project for Qatar. So that's really the driver for a lot of what's going on in Qatar. There are projects which are a lot more closely linked to the World Cup, so the stadiums are the obvious one. However, the rest of the infrastructure is infrastructure that they needed, and most of those things had been planned before they picked up the World Cup anyway. What the World Cup's done is just given them that impetus to really drive ahead and get it done by 2022. And then just one other event that I mentioned there just is the Grand Prix in Abu Dhabi, which is, I put that in as an example just because that's an event which has been going on now since 2009, I think. And you're still seeing ongoing development going on around that Grand Prix. So that just shows how once you get an event, that's a slightly different event to the World Cup because it's a recurring event, but it really has been a catalyst for developing that area of Abu Dhabi into a destination. What I'll finish off with is just a sort of snapshot of a few of the key markets. And the first one that I'd like to speak about is Saudi Arabia, which, as I said, has really been by far and away the most interesting story in the Middle East this year. at the beginning of the year, you were aware that oil prices were low, so that obviously has an impact on everything that goes on in Saudi Arabia. So there was that issue. And then there was the king dying, which was not unexpected. People knew that King Abdullah was ill, and it was expected that King Salman would come in as king. And before Abdullah had died in 2013, he'd appointed his half-brother Mukrin as the deputy crown prince. So what then happened is Salman became king and Mukrin became crown prince, so it was staying within that generation. He then named deputy crown prince, became Mohammed bin Naif, who's from the next generation. So that was the first time in the succession that we had someone from the new generation coming through. Then in early May, King Salman, well, sorry, no, get this correct, Crown Prince Mukrin resigned, and Mohammed bin Naif then got promoted from Deputy Crown Prince up to Crown Prince. So he's now actually the next in line to the throne as someone from the next generation. And very, very importantly, the Deputy Crown Prince position, which had been vacated by what is now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Naif, was Mohammed bin Salman, who's the king's son. So you've got the king's son's positions really being elevated. And his position in Saudi Arabia is really very, very strong. He's in charge of the ruler's court, of the king's court, the royal court. He's the Minister of Defence, so he's been very actively involved in military operations in Yemen. And they've changed the way that the oil sector is basically governed. So the oil ministry is separated out, Aramco and the oil ministry is separated. So at first you thought, well, hang on, this means there's a devolution of power for Aramco, so that can operate independently. And then the next day they said there's a new committee that's going to govern Aramco, and Mohammed bin Salman will be running that. So I think what you've seen over the last few months is you've seen the king and the king's sons really positioning themselves in charge of all the main sort of drivers of the economy in Saudi Arabia. And I think that's beginning to manifest itself into the construction industry. For better or for worse, I find the construction industry very interesting. So I see things like these political changes and I say, well, how's that going to affect the construction sector? I think what that's doing is I think that the younger guys that are coming in have got a slightly different way of looking at the way Saudi Arabia works. What's been done in the past is Saudi Aramco's been used to deliver non-oil and gas projects. And I think that's been a problem for Aramco. I think they would much rather focus on doing oil and gas, but they're getting drawn in to deliver hospitals and universities and things that's not really their core area. So I think that's one tension that there's been in Saudi Arabia. I think another tension that there's been in Saudi Arabia has been a real dominance of very, very big contracting organisations. The two main ones are Saudi Bin Laden Group and Saudi Oje. And there's been a lot of charges against them with people saying that it's, very bloated organisations operating on very easy contract terms on government jobs. And I think there's a feeling that there's definitely some inefficiencies there that need to be addressed. And what we're starting to see now is Aramco try to set up a different project management organisation with international partners that will manage construction projects within the kingdom going forward. So that alleviates that burden that Aramco had on non-oil and gas jobs, and at the same time take away some of that sort of reliance that the kingdom had on very large contracting companies, so they can give it to a PM agency who can then package up works, give it to other contractors and introduce a bit more competition and efficiency. So it's quite interesting at the moment just how that sort of very sort of high level political change is beginning to manifest itself into the way that the construction sector and the development projects are going to be procured and developed going forward. The other thing just to remember in the background in Saudi Arabia is the sort of the military action that's going on, which I think will affect a few projects that are on the border areas in the south near Yemen in particular, but I don't see that being a major problem. I think what it might be more of an issue is that whenever there's major problems or issues like military action, the decision-making capability within countries in the GCC is still quite narrow. It's very centralised governments, and the people that are making decisions on bombing in Yemen are the same people who are making decisions on signing off on contracts. So sometimes the development slows a little bit as people are distracted. If I then go to the UAE, I've covered most of these things already. We've got lower oil prices, which is a direct issue for Abu Dhabi. It's an indirect issue for Dubai. Dubai doesn't really have that much in the way of hydrocarbon production, but it's sitting in a region that is very active in hydrocarbons. So a lot of the people that are spending money in Dubai are the people that are getting their money from oil and gas sales. So there is an indirect impact there. Abu Dhabi, there's been a reduction in capital expenditure, particularly from the Abu Dhabi government clients. I think that's really been a knee-jerk reaction to the oil price, so that's been an issue there. Then at the same time, Dubai's had its own issues as real estate's become oversupplied. As I said, there's still niche areas for development. I think one thing that's particularly important, which I think is going to be mentioned later in some of the presentations that I had a little sneak peek at coming after me, is the airport in Dubai, which, if it goes ahead, which at the moment it looks like it will, but it's struggling, will be the biggest airport in the world by quite a margin, which has got about $33 billion worth of work to be done on it. And I think the issue at the moment is, where do we get the $33 billion to build the airport from? So that's a nice program of work that's meant to come through. I think at the moment they're just trying to work out how to make that happen. And then, like everywhere, there's still a real estate issue in terms of housing for local people. Moving on to Qatar. Low oil and gas prices, obviously a concern. There's been a phenomenal amount of work let in Qatar over the last few years. If you go to Qatar at the moment, it really is the walk I did to here this morning would be absolutely impossible in Qatar. It is just like walking across an entire huge building site. Last year, that was really beginning to make itself apparent as the market was overheating, the supply chain was becoming a problem. If you speak to people that are working particularly in things like roads, there's issues with aggregate, asphalt, just getting any kind of supplies in place, getting good staff, finding school places for your staff, kids who are working there, just everything's very, very tight in Qatar. I think what you've seen as a result of that from the middle of last year is you've seen the government, not publicly, but privately, has said, well, we've got a market that's overheating. Why is that overheating? We're trying to do a lot in time for the World Cup. Why don't we sort of just review what we do for the World Cup and then say, well, are the things that we can wait till after the World Cup and deliver them for 2030, which is when their strategic vision's set for. And you've seen a few examples of that. You've seen the Shark Crossing, which is a very fancy crossing across the bay in Doha, which has got a price tag of about $10 billion, I think, which is a huge it's a series of tunnels and bridges designed by Calatrava. That seems to have been delayed, and the feeling is that that's now a 2030 project rather than a 2022 project. You've seen a couple of other jobs as well, particularly on the petrochemicals side, which have just been rephased. So I think there has been an approach in Qatar to, well, let's just actually rationalise what we're doing. We're trying to do too much here. What's now happening is people are interpreting that as being well, they must think they're losing the World Cup and they're stopping building stuff, which I don't think is the case. I think it's really been a response to this market overheating. Market's overheating largely with a lot of new players. There's been a limited amount of contracting capacity in Qatar in the past. So there's been an awful lot of new players coming in, and in my view have probably at least taken on some risk there that's probably going to bite a few people going forward. As I'm sure everybody's aware, there's a lot of major problems at FIFA at the moment. As it stands for Qatar at the moment, there's no real smoking gun that's been found by a FIFA investigation that means Qatar should lose it. However, there's a lot of speculation that might be found going forward. I think there is a bit of concern in Qatar that there might be issues and possibly a rebid, but I think that's a bit premature. In terms of timing, it's definitely something which is viable. My feeling at the moment is I think we need to wait to see who the next FIFA president is and see what their attitude is to what's been going on at FIFA. Because at the moment we just don't know who's going to be running it, where that person's from. If it's someone who's from Africa, you're probably looking at someone who's going to be quite sympathetic to Qatar. If it's someone from Europe, maybe not so much. And the other thing that's really been a hot topic in Qatar is worker rights, working conditions. Very, very briefly, I think there's definitely room for improvement in terms of labour issues in Qatar. I think rather unfortunately some of the reporting that's been done on the labour issue has been a little bit erroneous, and some of the data that's been used has been not quite, it doesn't stand up to particularly rigorous scrutiny. As a result of that, I think the unfortunate thing is that it's really let some of the people in Qatar kind of off the hook, because what you've done is you've given false data, so it's easy for them to rubbish the data. And then you've missed the issue, and the issue is there is an issue. There are people that are badly treated, and there are people that lives do need to be improved, but because the data's been bad, it's kind of a funny situation where it's kind of let people off the hook. So I think that's an issue that I think will linger on. But I think on the whole, I think although still room for improvement, I think there are examples in Qatar where people are being treated fairly and properly. And I think the market is on aggregate improving. However, there are still a lot of examples where there is a lot more room for improvement than there really should be. Final market to touch on is Oman, which, if anyone's been there, you'll know that Oman's a very nice place. A smaller, much more, I was going to say, much more sleepy place than UAE, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but still has quite grand ambitions, particularly on the tourism side. Some quite massive infrastructure projects going on there at the moment. There's a new airport that's being built. There's a railway that's being tendered at the moment. And because it's quite a nice place and people find it quite a pleasant place to work, it's attracted quite a lot of interest over the last few years. But the reality is, compared to the other markets, the amount of work available is limited. When oil prices started to go down, Oman's probably the most at risk to low oil prices than anywhere else. At the moment, they're still very much committed to new projects. How long they can maintain that commitment is a little bit more of a different question. I think that's a real one to watch over the next few years, particularly as their cost of production are quite high. Their gas and oil and gas tends to be in tight formations, which requires sort of enhanced oil recovery techniques, which makes it more expensive. So they're really, it's not a case of like Saudi Arabia where the cost of production is so low they can really ride out the market. One other thing that's been going on in Oman, talking about the sort of the construction environment, Oman was the exception of Bahrain. Oman had a few protests in Sohar in 2011. One of the main things that was a gripe for people that were protesting was corruption, and it was mainly levelled at the Ministry of Transport. And as a result of that, there's been quite a crackdown on corruption in Oman, and you've seen the head of the biggest, I suppose it's the biggest local contracting company, got sentenced to time in prison for corruption, and a few other senior executives from a few other international companies got sentenced to prison time as well, as a result of that corruption crackdown. What that's meant in terms of government procurement, which is still the majority of the work in Oman, is that it's almost impossible for a government official to give a job to anybody that's not the lowest bidder. Because if you're not the lowest bidder, then someone's going to say, well, why have you given it to someone who's not put in the lowest price? So you're really, unfortunately, driving the market down in Oman. So that's been a real problem on the procurement side. And I think that leads me to where I am.